In the year 237 BC, within the dimly lit chamber of a Carthaginian temple dedicated to the stern deity Balaman, lord of the heavens and eternal flame, the air was thick and oppressive, heavy with the aromatic scent of incense intertwined with the pungent smell of spilled sacrificial blood. Before an altar stood a mighty man whose face bore the scars of countless battles, and whose eyes reflected an eternal sorrow for a war lost. He was leading his 9-year-old son to the stone platform, an act weighted with significance and foreboding. This man was Gamilcar Barca, known by the nickname Lightning, the greatest commander of Carthage at the close of the First Punic War. The boy's name was Hannibal, and he listened intently as the senior warrior prepared for a journey that would define history. Gamilcar, having suffered defeat not on the battlefield but through betrayal and short-sightedness among the oligarchs of his homeland, was about to set sail for distant Spain. There, in the far reaches beyond the intrigues and manipulations of the Carthaginian Senate, he intended to forge a new army, a new base for revenge. As he observed Hannibal's serious gaze fixated on the altar's blazing fire, he decided to ask if his son wished to accompany him on this perilous campaign. The child's eyes lit up with determination and resolve, a sign that he was already embracing the warrior's path. Without hesitation, Gamilcar took the boy's hand and led him closer to the sacred altar. Standing before the sacrifice, he issued a solemn decree, pressing his hand against the holy offering and directing his son to make a vow of eternal loyalty and allegiance. This oath was clear and unambiguous, that Hannibal, for as long as he lived, would never become a friend of the Roman people. In that ancient moment, under the watchful eyes of the gods, a young boy was bound to a promise that would shape the fate of empires. Few could have foreseen that this boy, who grew up nurtured by a deep-seated hatred of Rome, would, 2 decades later, lead a diverse army across the icy peaks of the Alps, traversing treacherous mountain passes with determination. He would march through fire and sword across the heart of Italy, leaving scars upon the very land, and ultimately strike a wound so profound and terrifying in the ancient city of Cannae that the memory of it would summon a chilling dread in Roman hearts for generations to come. This story is not simply about a battle, but about the collision of two worlds, the bustling maritime republic of Carthage and the expansive inland republic of Rome. It is a narrative about genius confronting the mightiest power of its time, a detailed, step-by-step analysis of a tactical masterpiece that continues to be studied in military academies worldwide as the quintessential example of encirclement and destruction. This is a tale about a day when destiny seemed poised to hang by a thread, when the fate of Rome teetered on the brink just before Hannibal's greatest triumph and the shameful defeat of the Roman legions. It is the story of the Battle of Cannae. Before the clash of swords and the screams of dying legionaries echo through the valley of the Aufidus River, it is essential to understand the titanic forces that converged upon each other in this deadly strife. The Second Punic War was far from an accidental border skirmish, it was an inevitable clash between two civilizations, two predatory powers vying for uncontested dominance over the Western Mediterranean. Their first encounter, known in history as the First Punic War, lasting from 264 to 241 BC, ended with a humiliating peace for Carthage. Yet, it did not resolve the underlying fundamental contradiction, merely transforming mutual distrust into a boiling hatred and a fierce craving for revenge. By the middle of the 2nd century BC, Rome had evolved beyond a mere city-state of the peninsular peninsula. It had become a hardened federation, forged through relentless warfare, with an iron grip that had firmly subordinated all of Italy under its control. The society of ancient Rome was fundamentally built upon a culture that revered warfare, discipline, and a profound sense of duty toward the state. Its strength did not lie in having brilliant, undefeated generals acting as lone heroes, nor solely in vast wealth and riches, but rather in the intricate and robust system that underpinned its institutions. The political structure of Rome, known as the Republic, was a complex machinery of checks and balances designed to prevent the concentration of power in any one individual. At its pinnacle stood two consuls, elected annually, who wielded supreme military and civil authority. While this dual leadership system was intended to distribute power evenly, it, at times, could lead to dangerous disconnects during wartime, especially when conflicting commands and rivalries emerged among the consuls. In reality, the true seat of authority resided with the Senate, a council composed of 300 elder statesmen who served for life. These senators represented the most noble aristocratic families, the patricians, whose influence was rooted in generations of lineage and tradition. The Senate dictated foreign policy, managed the state treasury, and commanded immense respect and authority across Rome. Although popular assemblies and certain committees were responsible for electing magistrates and passing laws, their role often proved subordinate to the decisions of the Senate, which acted as the key policy-making body. Yet, the most potent element of Rome's dominance was undoubtedly its formidable army. The Roman military machine had evolved over centuries, gradually becoming an embodiment of discipline, organization, and operational effectiveness. Unlike mercenaries motivated solely by monetary gain, Roman soldiers, citizens, farmers by profession, fought out of a deep sense of patriotic duty and a desire to defend their homeland. This sense of responsibility was an integral part of their identity and morale, fueling their resilience in battle and their willingness to endure hardships. The core fighting unit of the Roman military was the legion, an autonomous and highly versatile force comprising approximately 4,200 infantrymen, known as hastati, principes, and triarii, along with 300 cavalrymen. The uniqueness of Roman tactics lay in their formation, the manipular system. Unlike the rigid, monolithic Greek phalanx, the Roman legion was divided into 30 smaller subunits called maniples. These could operate either independently or in coordination within a flexible, unified line. This modular approach granted the legion exceptional adaptability, enabling it to fight effectively on various terrains, from open plains to rugged hills. A Roman legionary was equipped with an array of formidable weapons and armor. He carried a large, oval shield called a scutum, a sturdy helmet, greaves to protect his legs, a cuirass for his torso, and 2 javelins, called pilum, that could pierce enemy defenses. His primary close combat weapon was the short sword, the gladius, which became a hallmark of Roman military prowess. Yet the true backbone of discipline was not merely weaponry, but the ironclad obedience that soldiers adhered to. Violations of combat discipline, such as cowardice, could result in severe punishment, namely, decimation, where 1 in 10 soldiers was randomly chosen and executed as a warning. Conversely, acts of heroism and exemplary service earned warriors wreaths, medals, and honors that further motivated their dedication. This rigorously built system fostered soldiers with remarkable perseverance and unyielding courage in the face of adversity. Even after devastating defeats, Rome's enormous mobilization capacity, derived from its vast citizenry and loyal allies within Italy, enabled it to raise fresh armies, often larger, more aggressive, and even more determined than the previous ones. This resilience in the face of setbacks would eventually become a defining trait, allowing Rome to recover and continue its expansion. It was precisely this ability to rise from the ashes that represented a formidable challenge to adversaries like Hannibal, whose campaigns often confronted a seemingly inexhaustible foe. Across the Mediterranean, on the opposite shore of the Sicilian Strait on what is now the coast of Tunisia, lay Carthage, the emerging metropolis founded by Phoenician settlers from the city of Tyre. Unlike Rome, which was primarily a militarily based society, Carthage was a commercial empire with its power rooted in trade rather than conquest. Its strength stemmed from an expansive navy and merchant fleet that dominated the maritime routes spanning the Levant to Gibraltar. Carthaginian merchants commanded the seas, establishing a network of trading posts and colonies along the North African coast, as well as in Spain, Sardinia, and western Sicily. This naval and trading dominance enabled Carthage to control a significant portion of Mediterranean commerce, making it a wealthy and influential city-state. Its numerous outposts and merchant colonies facilitated the flow of goods, wealth, and influence across the seaways, contrasting sharply with Rome's land-based warfare. The Carthaginians' mastery of sea power and commerce formed the backbone of their empire, positioning them as a formidable rival in the Mediterranean landscape of the ancient world. The immense wealth accumulated by Carthage from its bustling trade in metals, slaves, ivory, and luxurious goods was truly staggering, reflecting the city's prominence as a commercial hub of the ancient world. Its political structure was primarily oligarchic, with power concentrated in the hands of a small, influential elite. At the top of this ruling class were 2 annually elected officials called suffetes, who served as the city's chief magistrates, analogous in some ways to Roman consuls. However, the true centers of authority resided within a narrow circle comprising the wealthiest merchant and landowning families. These families formed the Council of Elders, a governing body that exercised significant influence, and they also controlled the Supreme Court, known as the Court of 104. This judicial body was vigilant in preventing any military leader from gaining excessive power or independent influence, an essential safeguard in a city where commerce and politics were deeply intertwined. While this mercantile oligarchy was characterized by rational pragmatism, it often proved to be short-sighted. The city's leadership readily allocated funds toward building and maintaining a formidable navy to protect their lucrative maritime interests, yet they were markedly reluctant to invest adequately in a land army. They viewed popular land generals and military figures as potential threats to their authority, thus deliberately withholding resources that could have strengthened land forces. This strategic decision shaped the fundamental characteristics and the critical weaknesses of Carthage's military machine. Unlike the largely citizen soldier-based army of Rome, Carthage's military apparatus was predominantly composed of hired mercenaries. The native Carthaginians themselves rarely served in the army, preferring to pay for exemption from military service, thus maintaining their focus on commerce and governance. The core of the army consisted of infantry and cavalry from the local Libyan tribes and other African peoples under Carthaginian control. However, the bulk of the fighting force was made up of mercenaries recruited from across the Mediterranean basin. Among these were the skilled and hardy Malicus mercenaries from Sardinia, the dexterous Iberian and Spanish foot soldiers famed for their resilience and ferocity, the fierce and often unruly Gallic or Celtic warriors, and notably the renowned Numidian light cavalry, arguably the finest horsemen of the ancient world, capable of exhausting opposing forces over hours without saddles or bridles. Such an army was like a double-edged sword. On one side, it allowed Carthage to wage wars without diverting its own citizens from profitable trade, enabling the recruitment of the most professional soldiers of their era. On the other hand, this heterogeneous force was costly to maintain, often unreliable, and vulnerable to rebellion if mercenaries were not paid promptly, a problem that arose after the First Punic War. Moreover, replenishing losses was a challenging task due to the army's diverse composition and the limited pool of available recruits. This varied and multilingual mass of warriors depended heavily on two critical pillars: the wealth of Carthage, represented by its gold reserves, and the skill, leadership, and charisma of its commanding generals. By the time the Second Punic War loomed on the horizon, Carthage had in Hannibal Barca a general whose unmatched intellect and strategic brilliance set him apart from his contemporaries. While the great powers of Greece and Rome were busy nursing their wounds after the tumultuous aftermath of the First War and wary of each other's ambitions, in the distant Spanish province, far from the opulence and noise of Carthage or the bustling Roman Forum, a boy was growing up, destined to shake the very foundations of the ancient world. His name was Hannibal, a name that means gift of ball in Phoenician, a name befitting a prodigious talent believed to be a divine blessing from the mighty god. Hannibal was no ordinary prodigy. He was the product of a deliberate and carefully orchestrated upbringing, a true project shaped by his father, Hamilcar Barca. From the age of 9, he was immersed in military life, training in camp amid seasoned veterans rather than palaces or aristocratic surroundings. He grew up in harsh conditions, learning not only Greek military tactics and philosophical principles from his Greek instructors but also mastering the arts of survival, understanding the psychology of different tribes, and grasping the nuances of warfare from a deeply practical perspective. His education was as much about psychological endurance and strategic insight as it was about combat techniques, preparing him at an early age to someday lead armies and challenge the greatest civilizations of his time. He mastered several languages with exceptional fluency, and was capable of eating and sleeping alongside ordinary soldiers without any distinction. He personally participated in reconnaissance missions and was often the first to throw himself into the thick of battle. Such behaviors earned him an unquestionable authority among his troops. The soldiers saw in him not merely the son of their commander, but truly one of them, yet also the best among them. 2 centuries later, the Roman historian Titus Livius, who harbored a deep disdain for Hannibal as Rome's fiercest enemy, couldn't help but acknowledge his remarkable qualities. Livius wrote that Hannibal's courage in dangerous situations and his composed calm in the most perilous moments were extraordinary, and that no task, no matter how strenuous, could wear out either his body or his spirit. He endured the scorching heat and biting cold with equal resilience, consuming only what nature required, not for pleasure or excess. Frequently, he would sleep on the bare ground, covered only by his soldier's cloak, amidst sentries and watchmen, displaying an astonishing disregard for comfort. Always the first to rush into the fight, he was invariably the last to leave the battlefield. Behind those qualities of an ideal soldier, however, lay a cold, calculating, and deeply cunning strategic mind. Hannibal was a master of psychological warfare, well aware that his primary adversary was not merely the legions of Rome but the entire Roman system itself. He understood that Rome's strength lay in the unity of its Italian federation, and his strategic plan was both simple and brilliant: to shift the war onto Italian soil, inflicting a series of devastating defeats on the Roman armies in open battle, thereby demonstrating to Rome's Italian allies that their protector was not invincible. His hope was that, after such defeats, the Allies would turn away from Rome, depriving it of vital resources and mobilization capacity. Left isolated and vulnerable, the Eternal City itself would have no choice but to seek peace. This plan was rooted in a combination of military genius and subtle political manipulation. He took command in Hispania in the year 221 BC, following the death of his brother-in-law Hamilcar Barca. At just 26 years of age, Hannibal inherited a perfect instrument for executing his ambitious strategy. By then, his army was no longer a mere mob of mercenaries, it had been hardened in combat against the Iberian tribes, forged into a united and fiercely loyal force. Hannibal refined this army to the highest standards of military discipline and effectiveness. Its infantry was composed of varied units, with the most reliable and seasoned troops being the Libyans or Africans, veterans trained and armed in the Greek fashion, fighting in close-packed phalanxes. After his initial victories, Hannibal often rearmed this corps with captured Roman weapons such as gladii and cingula, trophies taken from battlefield spoils, which made them nearly indistinguishable from Roman legionaries. This transformation allowed them to stand toe-to-toe with Roman soldiers in close combat. They became a resilient bulwark, capable of withstanding any assault. Another critical component of his army was the Iberians, that is, the Spaniards, hardy, disciplined fighters armed with formidable falcata swords capable of cleaving through armor, and small shields known as cetrums. These troops formed Hannibal's dependable flanking forces, providing tactical stability along the sides of his main formations. The most numerous, but also the most unreliable, were the Gallic or Celtic warriors, who joined Hannibal only in Italy. Tall and fierce, they fought with ferocious intensity, especially during the initial attack, displaying remarkable bravery. However, they lacked endurance and discipline, and could not sustain prolonged engagements. Their fierce energy often turned the tide of the first assault, but their lack of cohesion meant they were less dependable in the long run. Hannibal masterfully exploited both the strengths and the weaknesses of his diverse army, always positioning his troops strategically within his battle formation. He deliberately arranged for certain units' inevitable retreats to become integral to his overall plan, transforming potential vulnerabilities into tactical advantages. The infantry supporting his campaign mainly consisted of renowned Balearic slingers, soldiers trained from childhood in the art of hurling stones or lead projectiles with astonishing force and pinpoint accuracy. Their deadly accuracy inflicted severe injuries on enemies and spread panic among opposing ranks even before close combat ensued, often turning the tide of battle early on. The core of Hannibal's might, however, was his cavalry, which consistently outperformed the Roman horsemen both in quality and numbers throughout the campaign. His cavalry was divided into two main categories. The first was the heavy cavalry, composed of Iberians and Gallic horsemen, heavily armored and armed with spears and long swords. These warriors were designed for shock tactics, able to pierce enemy formations and break through defenses with their formidable charges. Their primary role was to destroy the enemy's cavalry and deliver powerful strikes against the rear guard of the infantry, sowing chaos and confusion within the ranks of their opponents. The second and perhaps most spectacular element of Hannibal's cavalry was the Numidian light horsemen. These exceptional riders from North Africa mounted swift, sure-footed small horses, often without saddles, which made them highly maneuverable and capable of rapid movement across varied terrain. These scouts and skirmishers served as the eyes and ears of the army. They conducted reconnaissance, harassed enemy formations during marches, initiated hostile engagements, and, at critical moments, pursued and annihilated fleeing enemies, ensuring that no one escaped the consequences of defeat. Through their relentless pursuit and disruptive tactics, they consistently turned tactical victories into total destruction of the opposition. Hannibal's unconventional military machine also included war elephants, exotic beasts that, upon their first appearance on the battlefield, instilled terror in even the bravest foes. Although most of these giants perished while crossing the treacherous Alps, the remaining few had already made their mark in initial encounters. They primarily served as psychological weapons, terrorizing and disorienting enemies before any physical engagement took place, and often causing disorder amongst opposing troops just with their intimidating presence. More than just a commander, Hannibal was the brilliant mind and passionate heart behind this multilingual and multi-ethnic army. He understood that each element fought for different motives. The Gallic warriors sought fame and spoils, the Spaniards for dignity and loyalty, while the Libyans defended the future of Carthage. Hannibal knew how to speak to each of these groups in a way that resonated with their aspirations and fears. He succeeded in transforming this patchwork of tribes and nations into a unified and deadly force, a cohesive organism that responded solely to his will. In the spring of 218 years before our era, Hannibal, having sparked the war by capturing the allied Roman city of Saguntum in Spain, set this formidable army into motion, a campaign destined to reshape history. His goal was ambitious: to march from Spain into Italy, a move that would profoundly alter the balance of power across the Mediterranean. The world seemed to stand still, caught in a fragile equilibrium, yet beneath this calm, forces were quietly stirring, building tension that threatened to shatter the existing order. The thunderstorm was imminent. Hannibal's bold decision to carry the war into Italy itself would decide the fate of the Mediterranean basin for generations to come. Initially, the Romans dismissed the plan as fantastical, unable to believe such a daring strategy could be real. The Roman Senate declared war. Following their traditional approach, one consul, Publius Cornelius Scipio, was dispatched with an army and fleet to Spain, tasked with engaging Hannibal on that territory and preventing him from advancing further into Italy. Meanwhile, another consul, Tiberius Sempronius Longus, prepared a second force in Sicily, intending to land in North Africa and strike at the very heart of Carthage. Romans believed they would fight a conventional war on foreign soil, but they did not foresee that Hannibal himself was marching towards them, coming from the direction they least expected, from the north across the Alps. In May of that year, Hannibal set out from New Carthage, located in modern-day Cartagena, with an army that, by various estimates, numbered around 90,000 infantry and 12,000 cavalry. Although the journey was fraught with hardship and many of his troops and elephants perished during the crossing of the Alps, the remaining forces proved resilient and prepared to face what would become one of history's most legendary campaigns. In the midst of his campaign, Hannibal's forces numbered approximately 36,000 infantry and 37 battle elephants. His initial task was to force crossings and break through the territories held by hostile Celtic tribes in southern Gaul. This early phase of his march already inflicted significant losses on his army, compelling him to leave a portion of his troops behind to maintain control over the conquered lands. Many soldiers, reluctant to venture into the unknown, chose to desert instead of continuing onward. By the time Hannibal reached the River Rhone, known today as the River Rhone, his ranks had thinned considerably. It was precisely here that he was nearly intercepted by the Roman consul Scipio. The Roman fleet, which had been sailing toward Spain, had halted near Massilia, modern-day Marseille. Roman scouts reported that Hannibal's army was only a few days' march upstream along the river. Upon hearing this, Scipio immediately disembarked his troops and advanced to meet Hannibal, intending to engage him in battle. However, he arrived just too late. Hannibal, demonstrating extraordinary ingenuity in both engineering and diplomacy, had already begun his crossing of the Rhone. He negotiated with certain Gallic tribes, securing their assistance in the ferrying operations, while defending himself against others who resisted. Utilizing massive rafts and boats, Hannibal managed to cross the river under cover of night. The most challenging aspect of this crossing was the transportation of his elephants, which reacted with panic at the sight of water and refused to step into it willingly. To surmount this obstacle, Hannibal devised a clever ruse, camouflaging temporary landings on floating platforms hidden beneath earth and foliage, into which the elephants were gradually led. When Scipio arrived at the site of the crossing, he found only an empty camp. Hannibal had vanished, steering his route northward into the interior of the continent. This revelation was a shock for Scipio. The Roman commander quickly understood that Hannibal's true objective was Italy, and that he could only reach it by crossing the formidable Alpine mountain range. With this knowledge, Scipio made a prudent, yet ultimately fateful decision. He sent the majority of his army further west, to Spain, under the command of his brother Aeneas, aiming to cut off Hannibal's supply lines and reinforce his position from Iberia. This second phase of the campaign in Spain drained resources from Carthage and later proved to be one of the key factors contributing to Hannibal's defeats. Meanwhile, Hannibal himself, with a small yet highly determined force, turned back by sea to northern Italy. His aim was to regroup, gather new reinforcements, and prepare for the inevitable confrontation as he emerged from the mountains. The race against time continued. Hannibal's decision to march through the Alps in autumn was born of desperation and strategic brilliance alike. The coastal route was blocked by Roman forces, and crossing the mountains at that time of year was widely considered impossible. Hannibal intended to exploit this perceived impossibility by striking from an unexpected direction, from where his enemies least anticipated him. The precise route of Hannibal's Alpine crossing remains a subject of debate among historians to this day. What is certain, however, is that his army endured horrors beyond imagination, as described by ancient chroniclers in painstaking detail. The journey lasted for 15 days of relentless struggle against both the elements and hostile mountain tribes. The route ascended narrow, icy paths, clinging perilously above vertiginous ravines. With the first snowfalls, the rocks turned as slippery as glass, making movement treacherous. Men, horses, and pack animals slipped and fell in their hundreds, succumbing to the treacherous terrain. The cold was almost unbearable, especially for the African and Spanish troops, who were unaccustomed to the harsh winter conditions of the mountains. Supplies of food ran low, and firewood was nearly exhausted. To make matters worse, local tribes frequently mounted ambushes, sowing chaos by dropping enormous stones onto the columns of marching soldiers from above, often attacking from hidden positions in the mountain cover. Polybius vividly recounts one of the most dramatic moments of this ordeal, a massive landslide that blocked the narrow path, sealing Hannibal's route forward. Faced with this natural barrier, Hannibal was forced to undertake the arduous task of carving a new path into the mountain's face, smashing through the rock to open a new route for his troops and elephants. The journey through the Alps was a testament to the resilience, ingenuity, and indomitable spirit of Hannibal's army as they endured the relentless forces of nature and hostile tribes on their perilous march. According to the legendary account handed down by Titus Livy, ancient warriors would prepare for battle by creating enormous bonfires atop rocky cliffs, which they would then pour a heated and fiery vinegar mixture onto, causing the stones to crack and shatter. The purpose was to break these stones into manageable sizes, so they could be smashed further to serve as weapons or projectiles. While modern historians often doubt the veracity of the vinegar story because the amount of vinegar required for such a feat would have been practically impossible to gather, the core imagery of intense, titanic efforts to clear a path remains unquestioned. These heroic endeavors to carve through the mountainside, to forge a route in hostile terrain, symbolize the formidable will and relentless perseverance of the ancients. After enduring what seemed like an infernal ordeal of 15 days, a period of hellish struggle, the remnants of Hannibal's army finally descended into the valley of the River Pei in northern Italy, at the end of October, 218 years before our era. The sight that greeted their eyes was nothing short of horrifying. From the original force of approximately 50,000 soldiers who had begun the ascent, no more than 20,000 infantrymen and 6,000 cavalrymen managed to survive the ordeal, and most of the elephants had perished along the way. The soldiers were utterly drained, pushed to their physical and mental limits by hunger and cold, resembling wild beasts more than trained warriors. The dismal procession appeared as a pale shadow of its former self, seemingly fragile and ready to break apart at the slightest touch. It seemed that this ghostly army posed no imminent threat to Roman power anymore, yet, that was a grave mistake. These men had journeyed through an icy hell, having lost everything except their weapons and unshakable faith in their leader. Having reached the fertile lands of Italy, they stood on the brink of renewed violence, ready to kindle fires of war and satisfy their hunger at the expense of their enemies. The greatest military drama of the ancient world was poised to unfold. From the Alpine heights, Hannibal had advanced southward into Cisalpine Gaul, a region recently conquered by Rome. The native Gaulish tribes, such as the Insubres and Boii, seethed with hatred toward their conquerors, and the atmosphere was charged with hostility. This was exactly the situation Hannibal had anticipated. His primary goal was not merely to engage in combat with the Roman legions but to demonstrate his strength to these tribes and persuade them to join his cause. Hannibal understood that he needed their warriors, their supplies, and their intimate knowledge of the local terrain to continue his campaign effectively. To achieve this, he knew he had to shed Roman blood first, a gamble, but a necessary one. Meanwhile, the Roman consul Publius Cornelius Scipio, as history recalls, had taken an earlier route, returning to Italy by sea. He promptly assumed command over the legions stationed in the region and advanced to confront Hannibal's army, confident that victory over his exhausted and scattered opponent would be straightforward. In November, 218 years before Christ, the two armies' vanguards clashed on a plain near the waters of Ticinus, a tributary of the Po River. This confrontation was not a full-scale battle but more of a daring cavalry skirmish, yet its psychological impact was vast. Scipio personally led his cavalry, supported by light infantry units known as velites, to charge and engage Hannibal's forces. Hannibal, ever strategic, countered by deploying his finest Iberian and Gallic heavy cavalry, holding the flanks with Numidian horsemen. The initial attack by the Roman velites resulted in a volley of javelins and arrows, but it was swiftly pushed back by the onrushing heavy Carthaginian cavalrymen, who struck with formidable force. In terms of numbers and quality, the Roman cavalry was inferior and unable to withstand this onslaught. Meanwhile, in the center of the engagement, fierce combat raged, a brutal melee of swords, spears, and shields. Seizing the moment, Hannibal executed his characteristic tactical move. His Numidian horsemen, having circumnavigated the fighting infantry, launched a devastating flank attack from behind. This maneuver decisively turned the tide of the skirmish. The Roman cavalry was routed, thrown into disarray, and quickly began to retreat in panic. During the chaos, Consul Scipio was seriously wounded, a wound from which he nearly did not survive. According to one legend, it was his 17-year-old son, future renowned General Scipio Africanus, who heroically saved his father by pulling him out of harm's way amid the chaos. This small but heroic act embodied the fierce resilience and determination that would later become legendary in Roman history, illustrating how even an initial setback in skirmishes could set the stage for a much larger and decisive confrontation that was still to come. The defeat at the Battle of Ticinus marked a profound shock for the Romans. For the first time, they were forced to confront the undeniable dominance of Hannibal's cavalry in full force, witnessing firsthand the sheer superiority of his mounted troops. Scipio, recognizing that engaging such a formidable cavalry force on open ground was inevitably doomed to failure, decided to retreat with his army, leading them toward the hilly terrain of Zurica Trebia. It was in these elevated and rough lands that the advantage of Hannibal's swift horsemen could be effectively nullified, providing a possible respite and a strategic defensive position. Meanwhile, the Roman commanding general waited patiently for the arrival of the second consul, Tiberius Sempronius Long, whose army was then stationed in Sicily. For Hannibal, this small victory carried immense significance. It became a rallying point, a symbol of hope and a catalyst for rallying the Gallic tribes. Seeing that Rome's legions could be beaten, the Gallic allies, previously hesitant and cautious, began flocking en masse into Hannibal's camp, eager to join his cause, eager to take part in the prospect of turning the tide of the war. Their presence replenished Hannibal's thinning ranks, bringing fresh strength and renewed resolve to his forces. By December, the new Roman consul, Tiberius Sempronius Long, arrived at the camp of Scipio. This man was composed of a very different mold compared to the cautious and calculating Scipio. Long epitomized the typical Roman politician, popular among the populace, impulsive, self-assured, and driven by an insatiable desire for military glory, especially as his term of office was nearing its conclusion. He deeply regarded Scipio's prudence as cowardice and was eager to engage the Carthaginian forces in a decisive battle, confident that the combined strength of the two consular armies, amounting to roughly 40,000 men, would be enough to obliterate Hannibal's remnants. Hannibal, fully aware of the psychology and ambitions of his new adversary, chose to play a clever game to exploit Long's overconfidence. He devised an intricate plan that would soon become renowned as his masterpiece on Italian soil. The terrain at Trebia was predominantly flat plains, but there was a crucial natural obstacle, a stream with overgrown, bushy banks that cut across the valley. Seizing the moment during the night, Hannibal's seasoned troops, consisting of 2,000 warriors, a mixture of infantry and cavalry led by his younger brother Magan, hidden in the dense foliage, took up positions near this stream, perfectly concealed from the Roman eyes. At dawn on that cold December day, Hannibal began executing the second phase of his plan. He ordered his Numidian cavalry to cross the frozen river Trebia and strike the Roman camp, intentionally provoking the Romans into a sortie. His strategy was to lure the Roman forces into a hasty pursuit. True to his expectations, Sempronius Long swiftly took the bait. Without even allowing his soldiers a moment to eat or to warm themselves, he roused his entire army into action and set them into relentless pursuit of the retreating Numidians. The Roman legions forded the icy, waist-deep waters of the river. They emerged onto the opposite bank soaking wet, shivering from the freezing cold, famished, and exhausted from their forced march. No sooner did they regroup than they found themselves face to face with Hannibal's army, fully prepared, in battle formation, and ready for combat. Hannibal's troops, in contrast, appeared well-fed, warmed by campfires, and anointed with oil to protect against the cold. Despite their hardship, the Roman infantry, renowned for its resilience, launched a fierce assault on the center of Hannibal's forces, which consisted mainly of Gallic warriors. The engagement grew intense, fierce, and bloody, evolving into a relentless, grinding melee. Slowly but steadily, the Roman soldiers began to press hard against the Carthaginian lines. Sempronius Laon was already imagining victory in his mind, eager to claim a decisive triumph. However, this was precisely the moment Hannibal had anticipated. With masterful timing, he signaled his forces to unleash their flanking maneuvers. Hannibal's superior cavalry, reinforced by war elephants, struck at the disorganized Roman flanks, forcing the lightly guarded Roman cavalry on both sides into a panicked retreat. Following this, Hannibal's cavalry along with his light infantry swarmed the exposed sides of the Roman legions, turning the battle into a chaos of retreat and rout. When the tension in the fight reached its peak, Hannibal's strategic signal was given, unleashing the full force of his well-prepared tactics and turning the tide of battle decisively in his favor. Hidden in ambush, the troops commanded by Mago suddenly burst forth with a wild cry, emerging swiftly from their concealed position and striking the rear of the Roman army with unexpected force. The impact was devastating and electrifying. Attacked simultaneously from the front and the flanks, the Roman forces, already bogged down and disorganized, wavered under the fierce assault. Panic swiftly seized the soldiers, and chaos erupted into a savage slaughter that seemed unstoppable. Only the central segment of the Roman infantry, numbering around 10,000 men, managed to maintain their discipline. Thanks to their exceptional training and steadfastness, they pushed through the enemy ranks of Gauls and managed to break free from encirclement. These difficult yet successful fighters retreated toward the nearest city, Placentia, seeking refuge and regrouping. Meanwhile, the rest of the Roman army was practically annihilated, decimated, and defeated. Over 20,000 Romans lost their lives in this brutal engagement. On the other hand, Hannibal, having lost only a few thousand soldiers, mainly Gauls, secured his first significant victory. The town of Trivium, which had once been a vital Roman stronghold, now stood as a symbol of disaster for Rome. The victory at Trivium marked the loss of the entire northern region of Italy for the Roman state. Hannibal's strategic position was now secure, providing a comfortable winter base, and demonstrating to the world that his military genius could match and even surpass the most formidable Roman legions. Yet, for Hannibal, this triumph was merely the beginning. He was acutely aware that Rome was not yet defeated, the fight was far from over. In the coming months, he planned to push further south, directly into the very heartland of Italy, where he intended to launch a strike so devastating that it would shake Rome to its foundations. During the winter of 218 to 217 years before our era, Hannibal spent his time in Cisalpine Gaul. There, he regrouped his forces, gave them much-needed rest, and tirelessly recruited thousands of Gaulish warriors who were inspired and motivated by the recent victory at Trivium. In stark contrast, the mood within Rome was one of chaos and outrage. The defeat of the two consular armies marked an unprecedented disgrace and served as a serious blow to Roman prestige. The Senate and the Roman people demanded swift retribution for this calamity. In preparation for the new campaigning season of 217 years BC, two new consuls were elected, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus and Gaius Flaminius. Gaius Flaminius was a figure of great prominence, yet one wrapped in contradictions. He was the leader of the populars faction and enjoyed significant popularity among the common people, which earned him the disdain of the aristocratic Senate. Flaminius had previously gained fame as a tribunus plebis by passing a land allocation law, and later, as consul, he achieved glory by conquering the Gauls and constructing the renowned Via Flaminia, a road connecting Rome with the northern regions of Italy. He was known for his energetic nature and relentless drive, but, according to the aristocratic critics whose perspectives are preserved to us by historians like Polybius and Livy, he was also seen as overconfident, haughty, and dismissive of traditional religious rites. Most concerning of all was the opinion that Flaminius lacked any real military talent. Hannibal saw these weaknesses and decided to capitalize on them. In the spring of 217 years BC, he resumed his advance, heading southward once again. Among his tactical goals was to outflank the Roman armies that guarded the mountain passes of the Apennines. To do so, Hannibal chose the most direct yet perilous route, a crossing through the flooded marshes of the Arno River during the springtime height of its seasonal flood. This 4-day march became a grueling ordeal for his troops, comparable in difficulty to the legendary crossing of the Alps. The soldiers waded through water that reached their waists or even their chests, with little opportunity to rest or pause. Many had to sleep atop the bodies of fallen animals, and exhaustion, disease, and hunger took a heavy toll on them. Hannibal himself, riding on the sole surviving elephant, contracted a severe inflammation in his eyes. The hardships of this march resulted in him losing sight of one eye forever. Despite the suffering, this arduous maneuver gave Hannibal a critical strategic advantage. He succeeded in reaching the Roman general Flaminius's rear, positioning his forces between Flaminius's army and Rome itself. For the Roman commander, this was a double blow. It was both an insult and a challenge. Having Hannibal operating with impunity in the very core of Italy, ravaging villas and fields, was an affront to Roman pride and authority. It marked a watershed moment, revealing that Hannibal's daring tactics had placed Rome itself in grave danger, and that the war was entering a new, more unpredictable phase. In defiance of the advice given by his officers and the second senator, Servilius, who was leading his own army at a distance, Flaminius immediately charged forward in pursuit of Hannibal. His sole ambition was to personally crush the Carthaginian commander and claim all the glory that came with the victory. Hannibal, ever perceptive, had anticipated such a reckless move. He had chosen the battlefield with meticulous care, selecting a narrow valley on the northern shore of Lake Trasimena as the battlefield. This valley was accessible from the north through a narrow pass or defile, and it was enclosed on all sides by the lake and towering, densely wooded hills. Hannibal set his main camp atop an open hill at the far end of this valley, serving as a lure to lure the Romans into his trap. Meanwhile, his best troops had been concealed on the slopes of the surrounding hills, hidden from sight and waiting for their moment. His plan was both devilishly simple and remarkably effective. Heavy infantry, specifically the Libyans and Iberians, took positions at the entrance to the valley, effectively blocking any Roman attempt to retreat once their entire army had entered the enclosed space. On the long crest of the hill that overhung the road leading into the valley, Hannibal positioned his light infantry and his Gallic warriors, ready to strike. At the very end of the valley, behind the hill where his camp was located, he concealed his cavalry in a hidden ravine, allowing them to launch a swift and devastating attack from behind the Roman columns once they had advanced deep into the trap. It was early morning on June 21, in the year 272 BC, that Flaminius's Roman army entered the valley. The dawn was thick with fog that drifted over the lake, blending with the smoke rising from the fires set by Hannibal's forces earlier, obscuring to the Roman soldiers what was happening on the surrounding hills. The Roman column stretched out in a long, hurried line, having gone without adequate reconnaissance. Their eyes were fixed ahead on Hannibal's encampment, eager to engage him in battle as soon as possible. As the front of their formation drew near the Carthaginian camp and their tail was fully inside the defile, Hannibal gave the signal to attack. In that instant, absolute horror erupted. From the surrounding hills, thousands of Hannibal's warriors crashed down upon the unsuspecting Roman column with deafening battle cries from all sides. The heavy infantry sealed off the valley's exit, blocking any retreat. Meanwhile, the light troops and Gallic fighters launched their assault on the Roman flanks, and the cavalry struck from behind, catching the Romans in a devastating pincer movement. The Roman army was caught off guard at the worst possible moment, unable to reorganize due to the suddenness of the assault. The fog, which initially concealed Hannibal's forces, turned into a treacherous ally for the Carthaginians, now working against the Romans. They heard no commands, saw no threats emerging from their flanks, and could not identify the source of the mounting chaos. Panic quickly spread among them. What should have been a straightforward battle devolved into a brutal slaughter. Compassed between the hills and the lake, the Roman soldiers found themselves with nowhere to maneuver. Their traditional manipular tactics became useless in this confined space. They were attacked simultaneously from multiple sides and forced into chaos. Many desperate men tried to escape into the lake, stripping off armor and plunging into the waters, but most drowned beneath the weight of their heavy equipment. The battle raged on for nearly 3 hours, during which Hannibal's forces relentlessly tore through the Roman ranks. By the end of this fierce encounter, the Roman army under Flaminius was almost completely annihilated. Around 15,000 Roman soldiers had been slain, including the commander himself. According to legend, Flaminius was killed by a Gallic warrior seeking revenge for his people's subjugation. Additionally, about 15,000 more soldiers had been taken prisoner. Hannibal, true to his policy of sowing discord among Italy's alliances, released the prisoners who were allies from other Italian regions without ransom, declaring that he fought not against Italy itself but solely against Rome. A few days later, Hannibal achieved a decisive victory by annihilating a cavalry force of 4,000 men that had been sent by the second consul, Servilius, to support Flamininus. Over the course of only a few weeks, Rome suffered the loss of 2 armies and the deaths of its top military leaders, shaking the very foundations of the Republic. The path leading back to Rome was suddenly open. The enemy, having inflicted this devastating blow, was now in a position to threaten the city itself. The news of the disaster at Lake Trasimene sent shockwaves through the Eternal City, instilling widespread fear and panic among its inhabitants. For the first time in its long history, Rome faced an existential threat that seemed almost insurmountable. The Senate, overwhelmed by the severity of the situation, was compelled to resort to an extraordinary measure, one that was typically reserved for moments of mortal peril. It appointed a dictator, an individual granted absolute authority for a limited period of 6 months to guide Rome through this darkest hour. The man chosen for this crucial role was Quintus Fabius Maximus, whose military tactics would later be remembered as a complete antithesis to the traditional Roman way of waging war. Following the crushing defeat at Lake Trasimene, Rome teetered on the brink of collapse. The atmosphere was rife with despair, and chaos spread across the city. Women mourned their fallen husbands and sons on the Forum, the heart of public life, their grief echoing through the crowded squares. The Senate convened hurriedly, desperately seeking a way to escape what appeared to be an inevitable downfall. The enemy was at the gates, 2 consular armies had been wiped out, and the Roman spirit, once unbreakable, seemed shattered beyond repair. Yet, in the midst of this overwhelming chaos, the resilience of the Roman Republic's core revealed itself in the most unexpected way. Instead of capitulating, the city decided to appoint a dictator, Quintus Fabius Maximus, a scion of one of Rome's most venerable and ancient patrician families. Fabius was a stark contrast to the impulsive and overconfident generals like Flaminius and Sempronius who had suffered defeat. An elder statesman, an experienced military leader, and a prudent politician, he understood more clearly than anyone the true gravity of the situation. Fabius fully grasped 3 critical realities. First, he acknowledged Hannibal as a military genius, a commander whose brilliance outstripped that of any Roman general. Second, he realized that while Roman infantry remained formidable, the Roman cavalry had become hopelessly inferior to that of Carthage. Third, he understood that Hannibal's army, operating deep within enemy-held territory, was entirely dependent on supply lines and, crucially, incapable of replenishing its losses on its own. Building upon these insights, Fabius formulated a revolutionary strategy, one that diverged sharply from the traditional Roman approach to warfare, which prioritized direct engagement and decisive battles. Instead, he opted for a war of attrition, a method designed to wear Hannibal down gradually. This approach, later known as Fabian tactics, involved avoiding large-scale battles in open terrain where Hannibal's cavalry could have a decisive advantage. Instead, Fabius kept his forces close but at a safe distance, constantly shadowing Hannibal's movements through hilly, difficult terrain, preventing him from establishing supply lines or launching major assaults. His plan also included raiding isolated detachments of the Carthaginian army, such as supply and forage parties, and ambushing enemy convoys to weaken their logistics. Most importantly, Fabius adopted a scorched earth policy in regions that Hannibal targeted, destroying crops and destroying food stores to deprive him of provisions and to starve his army into submission. This strategy required patience, resilience, and relentless persistence, but it was arguably the only viable response under the dire circumstances. During the summer of 1717 before the Common Era, Fabius's forces shadowed Hannibal's army as it moved southward through Italy, into the wealthy regions of Apulia and Campania. Hannibal was hoping to incite local allied uprisings and rally support among Italy's city-states, but Fabius refused to engage him directly. Instead, he maintained a constant pressure through minor clashes and harassment, thoroughly exhausting Hannibal without risking a decisive defeat. His cautious, attrition-based tactics kept Hannibal on the defensive, preventing him from consolidating power or advancing toward Rome itself, while steadily draining the strength of his forces. Once, there was an almost successful attempt to trap Hannibal's army within a mountain pass by a clever Roman strategy, yet Hannibal's extraordinary cunning once again outwitted his opponents. During the night, he attached bundles of brushwood to the horns of 2,000 bulls, ignited them, and drove the herd toward the hills guarded by a Roman detachment. Mistaking this spectacle for an impending breakthrough, the Romans believed that the Carthaginian forces were attempting a major assault, prompting them to abandon their positions and rush towards the flames. Meanwhile, Hannibal quietly led his army through the now unguarded mountain pass, escaping from the trap that had seemed nearly foolproof. Despite his consistent strategic prowess, Fabius's tactics in this campaign were deeply unpopular among the Romans. Their society, accustomed to resolving wars in a single decisive battle, saw such cautious measures as cowardly and shameful. Witnessing how their lands were ravaged without adequate resistance, while their own army merely observed from distant hills, fueled this frustration. Ordinary citizens, whose fields and farms were burning and destroyed in the chaos of war, felt particularly aggrieved by the slow, defensive approach. This discontent extended into the political arena in Rome itself, where opposition to Fabius's leadership grew louder. The dictator was mockingly dubbed cunctator, a term implying slowness or sluggishness. Leading the critics was Marcus Minucius Rufus, a cavalry commander appointed by Fabius himself. Like Famine, Minucius was ambitious, eager for glory, and sought popular support. He openly accused Fabius of cowardice and inaction, criticizing his cautious tactics. On one occasion, while Fabius had to leave Rome to oversee religious ceremonies, Minucius, left in command of the army, disobeyed orders and launched an attack on a Carthaginian detachment, claiming a minor victory. This skirmish, which was of little consequence, was blown out of proportion and celebrated as a great triumph within Rome. Provoked by Fabius's opposition, the assembly made a startling decision elevating Minucius and the commander of cavalry to equal status with Fabius as joint leaders. This unprecedented move created a duumvirate with shared authority over the army, effectively dividing command. With half the army under his control, Minucius quickly resolved to engage Hannibal directly. Hannibal, ever the master strategist, immediately set a trap similar to the one at Trebia. Minucius's forces were encircled and brought to the brink of annihilation. Just when the situation appeared hopeless, the second half of the Roman army, led by the returning Fabius, appeared on the battlefield to reinforce the starving and cornered forces. Seeing the fresh legions, Hannibal, unwilling to risk an outright defeat, ordered a strategic retreat. Fabius's intervention saved his impulsive colleague from total destruction. According to tradition, a shaken Minucius, recognizing his misjudgments, stepped down from his command and once again submitted to the authority of the dictator. However, this episode only strengthened the Roman belief that Fabius's cautious approach was dishonorable, and that a swift, decisive offensive represented the only true path to victory. By late 217 BC, Fabius's term as dictator had expired, and power officially reverted to the consuls. Rome seethed with a desire for revenge, rejecting the slow, cautious tactics that had characterized Fabius's leadership. The city's leaders agreed on the need to assemble the largest army Rome had ever fielded and to deliver a single, crushing blow capable of ending Hannibal's campaign once and for all. In the consular elections of 216 BC, two figures emerged to embody the deep divisions within Roman society. One was Gaius Terentius Varro, a man from the lower classes, possibly the son of a butcher, who rose through popular appeal and was known as a fierce critic of Fabius. Varro promised the people a swift and forceful victory. His colleague was Lucius Aemilius Paulus, an aristocrat and seasoned general who had fought in the Italian wars and brought experienced military judgment to the Senate. In the summer of the year 216 before our era, Rome faced one of its most perilous moments. The Roman leadership, fueled by an unwavering confidence, assembled an enormous army unlike any seen before in the history of the Republic. The two consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, were tasked with commanding this monumental force for 2 consecutive days, each taking a turn leading what was, at the time, the largest army ever mobilized by Rome. Behind this colossal effort stood the entire thoroughly committed Roman state, calling forth every able-bodied man to take up arms. The result was a martial assembly of unprecedented scale, 8 legions, double the usual number, combined with contingents of allied troops. According to the ancient historian Polybius, the combined strength amounted to roughly 80,000 infantry and 6,000 cavalry, an armada believed by the Romans to be sufficient to crush Hannibal's vastly diminished army with sheer weight and power. There was an almost palpable certainty that victory was within reach, if not guaranteed. The Roman senators, lining the paths as the consuls set out on what was presumed to be a victorious campaign, harbored no doubt about their success. Their words of encouragement did not focus on the possibility of defeat, but on a different, more ambitious goal: the capture of Hannibal alive. No one in Rome dared to imagine that this extraordinary army was heading not towards triumph, but into the most harrowing slaughter in its history. By the summer's end, in the year 216 BC, this behemoth of Roman soldiers advanced southward into Apulia, where the Carthaginian general Hannibal had seized vital grain stores near a small town called Cannae, waiting patiently for his enemy. The stage was perfectly set for a blood-soaked tragedy. By late July, two hostile armies faced each other across the sun-scorched landscape, along the banks of a modest river known today as the Aufidus, or more commonly, the Ofanto. The scene was one of stifling stillness and oppressive, unyielding heat hanging in the air. Dust rose in clouds, kicked up by thousands of feet and hooves, mixing with the pungent odors of sweat, leather, and metal. The tension among the fighters had reached an intense crescendo. Every soldier, from the highest-ranking consul to the humblest legionary, every man from Hannibal's veteran cavalry to the most scratched and weary Balerian foot soldier, felt that this confrontation would decide the entire course of the war. It was not just another battle, it was the final showdown. Hannibal had chosen his battlefield with careful intent. The terrain was a broad, almost level plain, an ideal stage for his exceptional cavalry to perform at their best. The Aufidus River meandered across this open space, creating a natural curve that constrained the battlefield, which Hannibal planned to exploit fully in his tactical design. Meanwhile, the seasonal wind, blowing strongly from the southeast, known locally as the Vulturnus, was no coincidence. Hannibal, masterful in his strategic foresight, arranged his army so that this east-southeast breeze would blow directly into the faces of the Roman forces. The wind carried clouds of acrid dust and sand, blinding and choking the Romans, making their environment as hostile as the enemy itself. Every natural element and atmospheric condition had been calculated to work in Hannibal's favor, serving as an invisible weapon and a deliberate part of his battlefield plan. On the opposite side, the Roman army had established two separate camps. The main encampment, a formidable and well-fortified stronghold, was situated on the northern bank of the river, commanded by Publius and Gaius Aemilius Paulus. A smaller auxiliary camp, where the experienced Varron commanded, was positioned on the southern bank, closer to Hannibal's own position. This division of forces was already problematic, as it hindered effective coordination and mutual support. Hannibal, in contrast, had only a single fortified camp on the southern bank, strategically placed to maximize his tactical options. The Roman force was colossal, an overwhelming combination of infantry and cavalry, unparalleled in size for that time. The consuls, Gaius Terentius Varro and Lucius Aemilius Paulus, led this immense army, which many scholars and historians, both ancient and modern, estimate to have numbered around 80,000 foot soldiers and about 6,000 cavalry. While precise figures remain a subject of debate among experts, the consensus aligns closely with the estimations provided by Polybius, who viewed the Roman numeral strength as nothing short of formidable. The entire empire and its military might seem poised for a decisive victory, yet beneath this confident exterior, a complex web of strategic intricacies and potential vulnerabilities lurked, as Hannibal patiently prepared to turn the battlefield into a scene of catastrophic defeat for the Roman Republic. The Roman army numbered approximately 80,000 men, comprised of 8 traditional Roman legions and an equal number of allied Italic units. Despite its vast size, this formidable force was not without significant flaws. Nearly half of its soldiers were inexperienced recruits who had been called up after recent disastrous defeats at Trebia and Trasimenus, and many had never encountered Hannibal's tactics firsthand. The command structure was divided between 2 consuls, each holding the rank of military leader, who alternated in directing the army, which sometimes led to strategic disunity and indecision. The cavalry component was relatively small, ranging from 6,000 to 6,400 horsemen, yet this segment of the force represented a notable weakness. The Roman cavalry, composed largely of members from the equestrian class, along with allied Italic horsemen, fell short both in numbers and in combat experience when compared to their Carthaginian counterparts. More critically, they lacked the tactical training and cohesion that could have compensated for their numerical inferiority. Hannibal's forces, in contrast, were notably smaller but vastly more seasoned. His infantry, roughly 40,000 soldiers, were seasoned veterans fighters who had survived the arduous crossing of the Alps and had triumphed in 2 major battles. The core of his infantry was made up of disciplined and resilient African Libyans, referred to as Libyans and Iberians, Spaniards known for their ferocity and fighting spirit. The center of his line was filled with less experienced but fiercely passionate Gauls. Each soldier knew his commanding officer intimately and placed unwavering trust in him, creating a cohesive and highly effective fighting force. The cavalry under Hannibal numbered about 10,000 riders, with his heavy Iberian cavalry under the command of Gasdrubal, who should not be confused with Hannibal's brother, also named Hasdrubal, comprising approximately 6,500 horsemen. The light Numidian cavalry, led by Magorbil or Hannon, consisted of around 3,500 horsemen. This light cavalry was not only more numerous but also far superior in combat quality, outmatching the Roman cavalry decisively. Thus, the battlefield was set for a classic confrontation: on one side, the overwhelming numbers and brute force of the Roman legions; on the other, Hannibal's superior tactical agility, veteran experience, and abundant cavalry. The Romans sought victory through sheer weight, placing their bets on the destructive power of their heavy infantry and their unimaginably large army of 80,000 men. Hannibal, however, countered with tactical flexibility, leveraging the combat experience of his seasoned troops, exploiting the overwhelming cavalry advantage, and, most importantly, relying on his own strategic genius. In the days leading up to the decisive battle, skirmishes and demonstrations of force became frequent. Hannibal constantly provoked the Romans by sending Numidian cavalry to harass their supply lines, attack their camp's perimeter, and incite irritation. His goal was to frustrate the Roman commanders, forcing them into a confrontation on his own terms. Meanwhile, inside the Roman camp, a fierce debate was unfolding among the Roman leaders. Publius Scipio, observing the flat plains surrounding the Romans, urged caution. He recommended luring Hannibal into the hilly, more challenging terrain, where the Roman heavy infantry and manpower would have a decisive advantage, and where Hannibal's cavalry would become less effective. However, the consul Warl, driven by impatience and his own desire for glory, pressed for immediate engagement. He accused Scipio of cowardice, comparing his cautious tactics to the infamous strategy of Fabius Maximus, which had previously been ridiculed by some Roman factions. It was the law for the Roman consuls to alternate leadership daily, each taking command for a single day. During Pavlus's days of command, the army remained stationary, entrenched and preparing for battle. When Warl was in charge, the army slowly advanced towards Hannibal's position, tightening the noose and preparing for what was to come. The tension was palpable as each side prepared to face one of the most fateful battles in history, with differing visions on how the impending confrontation should unfold. By the end of the day on the 1st of August, the day dedicated to Emperor Emilius Paul, he found himself compelled to engage in battle despite his reservations. The situation was dire. The Carthaginians had cut off the Roman camp from its water source, leaving the legions to suffer from thirst. Nevertheless, Emilius Paul managed to confront the enemy on terrain that was far from favorable to Hannibal. The clash that followed did not produce a decisive advantage for either side, settling instead into a tense and inconclusive engagement. The very next day, on the 2nd of August, almost exactly 2 millennia ago, command of the Roman forces passed to Veron. Early in the morning, he issued orders for his army to break camp and form up for a grand battle along the southern bank of the river. Emilius Paul, although strongly opposed to this plan, could do nothing to prevent it. He was left with no choice but to obey, sharing with his colleague the burden of fate that awaited them on the battlefield. Despite the unfavorable terrain marked by unfavorable winds and difficult ground, his sense of duty was unwavering. He understood the risks but knew that he must lead his legions into combat. The mightiest Roman army, shining brilliantly in the morning sun with armor and standards gleaming, began the crossing of the Othot River, heading unavoidably toward what they recognized as their destiny. From his vantage point on a nearby hill, Hannibal watched the Roman movements with a faint smile. Everything was unfolding exactly as he had planned. The trap was set, ready to spring shut at the right moment. On that bright and scorching morning of August 2, 2116 years ago, tens of thousands of Roman legionaries and their allies crossed the narrow river and formed up on a compact plain prepared for battle. Their formations were unconventional, and in this very peculiarity lay the first and ultimately fatal mistake of the Roman command. Consul Gaius Terentius Veron, leading the legions on this day, saw before him an enemy force significantly outnumbered in infantry but no less confident. His strategy was straightforward, almost as sharp and precise as a Roman gladius, based on an extreme interpretation of traditional Roman tactics. Instead of stretching his lines wide to envelop Hannibal's flanks, Veron decided to crush the center by narrowing and deepening his formation to the utmost. His legions were arranged not in the usual Roman rectangular or rectangular-like formations, but in dense, deep columns. The distance between these manipular units was minimized to the point that the entire battalion resembled a clumsy, unwieldy Greek phalanx, a mass that seemed ill-suited to the flexibility that Roman tactics generally relied upon. Veron's plan was clear: concentrate all his overwhelming strength, around 80,000 foot soldiers, into a devastating single punch, aiming to shatter Hannibal's center, split his forces in half, and sweep them off the battlefield in one massive collision. This tactical move ignored the potential threats from the flanks, banking on the assumption that his relatively small cavalry force could hold Hannibal's horsemen at bay for enough time. Meanwhile, the infantry's strength in the center was supposed to decide the outcome. Such a decision stemmed from arrogance, underestimation of Hannibal's skillful, fluid tactics, and a fundamental misunderstanding of battlefield flexibility. The Roman battle formation was set as follows: on the right flank by the river, the cavalry stood ready, approximately 2,400 horsemen under the command of the consul Lucius Aemilia Paul. At the core of the formation lay the entire Roman and allied infantry, arranged in those deep, unusual columns. Leading these were the proconsul Gnaeus Servilius Geminus from the previous year and the cavalry commander Marcus Minucius Ruff, both positioned prominently at the front lines, prepared to lead their troops into what they hoped would be a swift, decisive victory. On the left flank, there was the allied cavalry, approximately 4,000 horsemen under the command of the renowned Veron. Positioned ahead of the main Roman line was the light infantry of Velites, serving as a screening force. Observing the Roman formations, Hannibal quickly grasped their underlying strategy and responded with a military arrangement that was entirely contrary to their approach. His deployment was delicate, adaptable, and designed not for direct confrontation but for deception and maneuvering. In the very center of his battle formation, Hannibal placed his most unreliable units, namely, the Iberian and especially the Gallic infantry. He knew well that these troops would not withstand a head-on assault by Roman legions, however, their role was not to do so. Instead, he arranged them not in a straight line, but in the shape of a convex half-moon or a bow, with the convex side facing the Romans. This configuration served as a lure, a trap. Its purpose was not to hold their ground, but to gradually and systematically retreat under the Roman pressure, drawing them deeper and deeper into a tightening noose. Flanking this Gallic center, but set slightly back in stepped formations, Hannibal positioned his best infantry, the hardened African veterans armed with spoils of war, including captured Roman weapons. These veteran troops remained concealed from the advancing legion's view and were meant to enter the fray at a crucial moment, like the jaws of a trap. Surrounding the enemy center, they would deliver the decisive strike. On the left flank, facing the Roman consul Aemilius Paulus, Hannibal concentrated his strongest attack force, around 6,500 horsemen commanded by Gastroble, the Beergal heavy cavalry. Their mission was swift and clear: to crush the opposing Roman cavalry and then, by maneuvering around the battlefield, to strike the rear of the allied cavalry on the opposite flank. Meanwhile, on the right flank facing Varus, the Numidian light cavalry, approximately 3,500 horsemen under the command of Magoarbal, were tasked with a more intricate challenge. Their role was not to destroy the numerically superior allied cavalry, but to engage it in combat, tire it out, and simulate a retreat. This maneuver was designed to prevent the enemy from reinforcing the Roman infantry in the center. Hannibal's entire plan was rooted in deception, impeccable timing, and leveraging the strengths and weaknesses of each of his units. He deliberately weakened his center to turn it into a flexible trap and placed his full confidence in dominating his cavalry. The battle erupted with a clash between the light troops. Velites from Rome and Hannibal's Balearic skirmishers engaged in a fierce firing exchange, hurling lead pellets and stones with whistling precision. The air was thick with projectiles flying to and fro, causing casualties on both sides. However, this preliminary skirmish was brief, serving merely as the prelude to the true confrontation. The decisive moment of the battle would come when the main forces collided. While the central engagement was brewing, Hannibal activated his most powerful trump card. On his left flank, Gastrobal's heavy cavalry launched a sudden and overwhelming assault like a tidal wave against Aemilius Paulus' Roman cavalry. The clash was swift and brutal. The Iberian and Gallic horsemen, outnumbering and outdrilling their Roman counterparts, fought with fierce enthusiasm and rage, swiftly overwhelming them. Many Roman horsemen were thrown from their mounts and forced to fight on foot, but their resistance was short-lived. The Roman consul, Aemilius Paulus, was severely wounded during the combat but refused to abandon the battlefield, instead joining the infantry in the thick of the fight. Simultaneously, on the opposite flank, the Numidian cavalry under Magoarbal engaged Varus' allied cavalry in a tough engagement, aiming to tie them down and exhaust them, keeping them from intervening at the critical moment in the center. In this encounter, the battle took on a different character than before, yet the media strategists, adhering faithfully to their tactic, avoided direct hand-to-hand combat. Instead, they encircled their Roman allies, pelting them with javelins from all sides, continuously alternating between retreat and renewed assaults. This relentless pressure effectively restrained and completely neutralized one flank of the Roman cavalry, preventing it from interfering in the course of the fight. Meanwhile, in the center of the battlefield, the Roman infantry, a formidable force, advanced as planned. Like a raven swooping upon its prey, they charged with all their might into the bulging center of Hannibal's line. Under the crushing weight of thousands of legionnaires, the Gallic and Iberian units embedded there began to buckle. The Roman soldiers, sensing that victory was within reach, roared with triumph and surged forward into the widening breach. Their ranks grew increasingly dense and impenetrable, with soldiers behind pushing forward and adding to the pressure. They did not notice that the semicircular formation they believed they were breaking through was not collapsing inwards. Instead, it was gradually and methodically bending backwards, transforming from a convex arc into a concave curve. Unknowingly, the Roman army was pushing itself deeper into a trapping pocket. The decisive moment of the battle arrived suddenly. Gastroble, having defeated the Aemilian Paul's cavalry, chose not to chase the fleeing enemies. Instead, demonstrating exceptional tactical discipline, he ordered his heavy cavalry to turn around and maneuver behind the entire Roman formation. With swift precision, they circled around and launched a flanking attack on Warren's allied cavalry, which was already engaged by Numidian forces from the front. The sudden two-pronged assault caught the Romans completely off guard. Warren's cavalry was routed and thrown into disarray, fleeing from the battlefield. Meanwhile, the Roman consul, Veron, along with a small detachment, retreated in chaos. At this point, Hannibal had achieved complete dominance over the flanks, effectively controlling the battlefield's outer edges. As the Roman legions, distracted by their pursuit of the Gallic units, pressed forward to the maximum extent, Hannibal issued a signal to his African infantry. From their positions on the flanks, initially standing still like static theater boarders, two elite bands of African soldiers suddenly executed a precise pivot inward. Like the jaws of a metal wedge, they drove deep into the unprotected flanks of the Roman infantry, which had already begun to fold into the encircling trap. This development was a shocking blow for the confident legionaries, who had believed in their inevitable victory. Now, they found themselves attacked from both sides simultaneously, caught in a vice. The final act of this tragic tableau unfolded when Gastrobal's and Magarbal's cavalry, having eradicated the Roman cavalry units, reformed and charged with devastating force into the rear of the now-pinned Roman infantry. The circle was complete. The vast Roman army, numbering around 80,000 men, was encircled from all sides. What happened next was no longer a conventional fight but a calculated, cold-blooded slaughter. The Roman legionaries, pressed together in a dense, uncontrollable mass within a confined space, lost all capacity not only to maneuver but even to lift their weapons. The rear ranks pressed relentlessly on the front lines, thwarting any effort to fight back. This packed-in mass presented an ideal target for the Carthaginian forces, who, standing around the perimeter of this human cauldron, unleashed lethal spear and sword strikes into the throng. The screams of wounded men, the clang of weapons, and the wheezing of dying soldiers blended into a terrible, deafening din. The slaughter persisted until nightfall. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the battlefield of Yukon revealed an apocalyptic scene. For hundreds of meters, the scorched earth was strewn with heaps of corpses and blood-soaked ground. Different estimates suggest that on that day alone, from 50,000 to 70,000 Roman soldiers lost their lives in the raging chaos. Among those slain in the battle were Lucius Aemilius Paulus, the Roman consul, Gnaeus Servilius Geminus, the proconsul, Marcus Minucius Rufus, a former cavalry commander, as well as 80 senators or candidates for the Senate, hundreds of cavalrymen, and thousands of officers. This was far from a mere military setback. It marked the annihilation of the very elite and backbone of Roman society at the time. The Carthaginians suffered losses estimated to be between 6,000 and 8,000 men, most of whom were Gauls who had borne the brunt of the initial assault. Hannibal's victory at Cannae was not just a defeat of an enemy army, it was a catastrophic obliteration of the Roman forces, a devastating blow to their political and military fabric. The battle became a legendary example of tactical genius, a textbook illustration of encirclement and total destruction in warfare. Its name has since become synonymous with complete encirclement and utter defeat. However, standing amid the bloodied field strewn with the bodies of fallen foes, Hannibal himself did not yet realize that this, his greatest triumph, was also to mark the beginning of his downfall. Evening was falling, the sky painted in a bloody sunset that mingled with smoke rising from the smoldering wagons and supplies. The battlefield was thick with tens of thousands of corpses, creating a scene of utter horror and devastation. Hannibal, slowly riding through the battlefield, surveyed the scene of his victory. His seasoned veterans, exhausted from hours of relentless slaughter, were busy stripping armor from the fallen enemies, collecting trophies, and tending to the wounded, both friends and foes. The victory was total, almost unimaginably complete. It appeared the war was over, Rome was doomed, and the entire destiny of Italy was hanging in the balance. That evening, within Hannibal's tent, his closest allies gathered to celebrate what they believed was an unbeatable triumph. The mood was euphoric. Megarbal, a hero of the Numidian cavalry and one of Hannibal's most passionate and skilled generals, approached him with enthusiasm and declared that he would immediately set out with his cavalry to pursue the fleeing Roman forces. He confidently predicted that within 5 days, Hannibal would be feasting on the capital, having secured a swift and decisive victory. He urged Hannibal to lead his forces forward, promising to arrive ahead of the Romans and hopefully shock the very heart of Rome itself with the speed of their advance. Yet Hannibal remained silent, absorbed in studying the strategic map spread before him. He weighed the situation carefully, considering all aspects and consequences. After a long pause, he refused the invitation, declining to make an immediate push toward Rome. Hannibal believed that a sudden and unplanned march on the Roman capital at that precise moment would be an act of reckless daring and outright gamble too perilous to undertake without further preparation. Megarbal, furious at what he saw as hesitation, could hardly believe his ears. He was convinced that such a fleeting opportunity to strike at Rome's own doorstep was too good to miss. In his anger, he uttered words that would echo through history, a phrase that would be remembered for centuries to come. He suggested that truly, the gods did not grant all blessings to one man alone. While Hannibal was undoubtedly a master of victory, he lacked the ability to turn that victory into lasting dominance. According to Megarbal, Hannibal was capable of winning battles, but had not learned how to capitalize fully on those victories. This heated argument within Hannibal's tent became one of the most famous and debated moments in ancient military history. The question that looms to this day is whether Hannibal was right in aiming for a cautious consolidation or whether he missed a singular, golden opportunity to bring the war swiftly to a decisive end. For over 2,000 years, historians have wrestled with this dilemma, pondering whether his decision was wise or whether it marked a tragic mistake. Supporters of Hannibal's cautious approach present several compelling reasons that likely influenced his choice. First, the state of fatigue and losses in his army was significant. Despite their victory, Hannibal's forces had been thoroughly exhausted by the intensity of the battle. The soldiers needed rest and time to recover after such a brutal encounter. Moreover, the Carthaginian army had suffered the loss of approximately 8,000 of their finest warriors, an almost catastrophic toll. Launching a full-scale assault on a well-fortified Roman city, especially with a depleted and tired army, would have been akin to rushing headlong into disaster. Secondly, Hannibal's logistical situation was far from ideal. His army was thousands of kilometers away from their supply bases in Spain and Africa. They had no heavy siege equipment, no catapults, ballistas, or battering rams that would be crucial for an effective attack on a city like Rome, protected behind formidable walls and a powerful defensive system. Without proper siege machinery, any attempt to storm the city from the outside would have been destined for failure, likely resulting in a prolonged and miserable siege or complete defeat. Thirdly, there were practical concerns about supply and logistics. As their army moved southward, they needed steady access to food, water, and other essential supplies. Operating so far from their bases meant that extending their campaign would severely strain their resources, risking shortages that could weaken their position just when they needed to be at their strongest. Together, these factors created a complex web of strategic considerations, leading Hannibal to prioritize a more cautious, deliberate approach rather than rushing into an immediate offensive against Rome itself. The supply lines had long since been severed, leaving the besieged city utterly isolated and vulnerable. Encircling a vast metropolis, comparable in size and grandeur to ancient Rome, without access to external resources, would have demanded an extraordinary amount of provisions, something impossible to procure from nowhere. Unlike this hypothetical scenario, Rome, with its mastery over the sea, possessed the strategic advantage of unimpeded sea avenues to bring in supplies, ensuring its resilience against prolonged sieges. Furthermore, Rome was by no means defenseless. Even though its main field army had been shattered, the city itself still retained at least 2 legions assembled specifically for its protection. These forces, along with the remaining military units, stood ready behind the city's walls. In addition, once the news from the Battle of Cannae reached the Senate, it would have sparked a surge of extraordinary energy and determination. The Senate, driven by the gravity of the defeat, would have mobilized every man, woman, and even boy, calling on the elderly, the youth, and enslaved persons alike, to rally for the city's defense. Such a rapid and comprehensive mobilization made any notion of immediate capitulation highly unlikely. The strategic plan of Hannibal also played a crucial role in shaping the situation. It's important to remember that Hannibal's initial goal was not the outright conquest of Rome itself, but rather the disintegration of the entire Italic Federation. His hope was that, following devastating victories like Cannae, the Italian allies would abandon Rome in droves and join his cause. Hannibal had decided to consolidate his triumph in southern Italy first, establishing a strong base there, which would be reinforced by reinforcements from Carthage. Only after securing this foothold and drawing manpower from his homeland did he intend to weaken Rome by removing its resources, thereby forcing the city into submission through attrition. Supporters of the traditional view, both ancient and modern, argue that Hannibal missed a crucial psychological opportunity. Primarily, they point to the wave of morale collapse that would have been unleashed if Hannibal's cavalry had suddenly appeared at the city gates. Such an event could have triggered widespread panic, led to slave revolts, and caused parts of the population to capitulate, thereby breaking the Senate's will to resist. The city's morale might have been overwhelmed entirely. Secondly, Rome lacked a field army capable of standing up to Hannibal in open combat. The city could not muster a large enough force to confront his army directly in the open plains. Any hastily assembled detachments would have been easily defeated on the march or at the gates. Hannibal could have employed a blockade, simultaneously besieging and ravaging the city's surrounding countryside with impunity. Third, there was the symbolic significance of such an invasion. The very presence of a hostile army at the gates of the Eternal City, the metropolis that had not faced invasion since the Gallic sack in 390 BC, might have had unpredictable political repercussions. It could have become the final straw, overflowing the cup of Roman patience, and driven the city to seek peace, surrendering to Hannibal's terms. Indeed, we will never know whether history might have taken a different turn had Hannibal heeded Megorbal's advice. History, of course, does not yield to the subjunctive mood, but facts remain, unaltered by hypothetical musings. Hannibal chose not to march on Rome itself. Instead, he sent envoys with offers of peace and ransom for prisoners, an act that underscores a strategic choice rather than weakness. When the first rumors, followed by grim confirmations, reached Rome about the dire situation in their city, a wave of terror swept through the population. The ancient historian Titus Livy records that never before, aside from the actual sack, had Romans experienced such panic and confusion. It seemed as if all was lost. Yet, precisely at this moment of crisis, the indomitable spirit of Rome revealed itself in full force. Under the leadership of the remaining elders and the surviving senators, including Quintus Fabius Maximus, the city's authorities quickly regained control of the situation. Outward signs of grief, public mourning, and mass gatherings of despair were prohibited, and the city gates were closed tight to prevent chaos from spiraling farther out of control. When Hannibal's envoys arrived in Rome seeking peace, the Senate refused even to listen to their proposals. In an unprecedented move, the Roman leadership resolved to reject any ransom for prisoners, declaring openly that Rome did not need soldiers who had allowed themselves to be captured. Such a decision epitomized the resilient resolve and unwavering refusal to surrender, illustrating that even in the face of overwhelming adversity, the Roman spirit endured and refused to capitulate. This was an incredibly bold and powerful strategic move, designed to send a clear and unmistakable message to the entire world, that Rome was not defeated, that it would fight fiercely until the very end. In response, the Romans launched a complete mobilization of their resources and manpower. They formed new legions, rallied their citizens, and called upon even their youngest men. 17-year-old youths were conscripted into the ranks. Additionally, they arranged for the purchase and armament of 8,000 slaves, promising them freedom if they displayed bravery in battle, thereby transforming them into auxiliaries in the war effort. The Roman authorities also confiscated old weapons from temples and places of worship, which had been dedicated to the gods, repurposing these relics of sacred arsenal to strengthen their armies. Through these measures, Rome demonstrated that its greatest resource was not merely gold or seasoned soldiers, but an unbreakable spirit, an indomitable will to endure and overcome. Following the Battle of Cannae, the conflict entered a new, more complex phase. In this stage, Hannibal achieved a measure of success, securing some victories since many cities and tribes of southern Italy, including Capua, the second largest city of Italy, defected and switched their allegiance to his side. This gave him access to vital bases and much-needed supplies, yet the core of the Italian Confederation still remained loyal to Rome. The war gradually evolved into a prolonged and exhausting grind, turning into a war of attrition that tested the limits of both sides' endurance. The Romans, adopting the tactics championed by the Roman general Fabius, deliberately avoided large-scale battles, instead choosing to wear down Hannibal's forces through slow, steady, and methodical sieges, reclaiming city after city across Italy, gradually choking his campaign. Meanwhile, in Spain, a young Roman public named Cornelius Scipio, remembered for rescuing his father during the battle at Ticinus, began a remarkable and brilliant military campaign. His efforts aimed at cutting off Hannibal's Spanish base, which would ultimately deprive him of his most crucial supply line and strategic position. Paradoxically, Hannibal's greatest victory at Cannae, though a martial masterpiece, turned out to be a strategic dead end. Despite winning every battle, Hannibal found himself losing the war, as his sweeping victories failed to lead to decisive political or military collapse of Rome. The Battle of Cannae did not bring an end to the Second Punic War. Instead, it prolonged the devastating conflict for another 14 long, bloody years. Hannibal, confined to southern Italy, engaged in a tedious, attritional struggle, slowly losing his veteran soldiers and receiving little meaningful support from Carthage. Meanwhile, Rome, shaken but resilient, recovered from the shock of Cannae and systematically built up its strength elsewhere. Roman forces pressed in Spain, on Sicily, and ultimately in Africa itself. The decisive blow came when Scipio, having learned from Carthage's setbacks and tactical defeats inflicted by Hannibal, landed fresh forces in North Africa. Using the tactical lessons gleaned from past failures, Scipio delivered a crushing defeat upon Hannibal at the decisive Battle of Zama in the year 192 before our era, effectively ending the war and marking the collapse of Carthage's power and prestige. Despite Hannibal's ultimate defeat, his victory at Cannae became an unparalleled model of military ingenuity, forever etched into the annals of warfare. His tactical brilliance left an enduring legacy that has influenced military thought for centuries. The Battle of Cannae became the archetype of encirclement and complete destruction of the enemy forces, a legendary example that generals throughout history studied and sought to emulate. For Rome, on the other hand, Cannae served as a harsh but invaluable lesson. The Romans recognized their vulnerabilities, particularly their flanks exposure, lack of tactical flexibility, insufficient reconnaissance, and underdeveloped cavalry tactics. Future great commanders such as Scipio Africanus, Marius, and Julius Caesar learned from these mistakes and improved their military doctrines accordingly. They restructured the Roman legions, making them more flexible and adaptable, and enhanced the role of cavalry and auxiliary units to better respond to diverse battlefield challenges. Ironically, the defeat at Cannae strengthened the Roman military apparatus, transforming it into an even more formidable and sophisticated fighting force. The name Cannae became synonymous with tactical genius and military innovation. This battle's lessons reverberated through history, influencing military thinkers such as Friedrich the Great, Napoleon Bonaparte, and commanders of the American Civil War, each of whom drew inspiration from Hannibal's mastery, adapting its principles to their own contexts. Throughout history, countless military strategists and commanders drew inspiration from Hannibal's daring maneuvers, yet the most profound influence on military doctrine came from the tactical innovations of the Renaissance and later periods, particularly those of the 16th and 17th centuries. One of the most famous military plans of this era, Schlieffen's strategy, crafted before the outbreak of World War I, envisioned a vast encirclement and massive troop deployment aimed at enveloping the French army. In essence, it can be seen as an attempt to replicate the strategic essence of the Kenny envelopment on an even broader, more ambitious scale. Similarly, the concept of blitzkrieg, based on deep tank penetrations and encirclement of enemy pockets, draws a subtle but clear line back to Hannibal's masterstroke for Rome. The infamous date of August 2nd, in the year 2016 before the Common Era, forever remains a dark chapter etched into collective memory. The memory of the Battle of Cannae became woven into the very fabric of Roman identity, representing both the greatest peril ever faced by the state and a symbol of indomitable Roman resilience. The phrase Hannibal at the gates became a common idiom in Rome, serving for generations as a warning to misbehaving children and as a poetic expression of an imminent, mortal threat. The figure of Hannibal in Roman and subsequently European culture took on a complex, dual nature. On one hand, he was perceived as a treacherous, brutal, and cunning enemy, an epitome of deception and betrayal, with unwavering loyalty often equated with treachery. On the other hand, he emerged as a brilliant military tactician, a tragic hero, and a man who, standing alone against the odds, challenged his destiny and nearly secured victory. His legacy inspired countless artists, writers, musicians, and thinkers from the Renaissance forward, shaping cultural perceptions of heroism, villainy, and genius. The story of the Battle of Cannae provides several timeless lessons, still relevant in modern times. First is the danger of underestimating the opponent. Rome's defeat was all but sealed before even engaging in battle, as Varro, blinded by numerical superiority, failed to appreciate Hannibal's strategic brilliance and the complexity of his army. Overconfidence and arrogance rooted solely in brute force led to a catastrophic downfall. Secondly, the importance of flexibility in tactics becomes evident. Hannibal won because his thinking and his forces were adaptable. He transformed what appeared to be a vulnerability and unwieldy, untrustworthy center into a strength by turning it into a trap. His army's key elements, cavalry and elite infantry, were employed precisely at the decisive moment and in the critical location, turning the tide of battle. The third lesson pertains to the crucial roles of psychology and leadership. Hannibal was not merely a tactician but a master psychologist as well. He understood the mentality of his enemies and played skillfully on their fears and weaknesses. His multi-ethnic army, despite its diversity, comprising people from different backgrounds and loyalties, acted cohesively because Hannibal was its unquestioned leader, inspiring unwavering loyalty. Fourth, a tactical victory does not ensure overall strategic success. Cannae exemplifies how a single, brilliant engagement, the slaughter of massive Roman forces, can still result in a broader strategic failure. Winning the battle was only part of the equation. The war itself depended on political, economic, and logistical support, which Hannibal lacked for prolonged conflict. While he was a genius on the battlefield, he fought alone. Behind Rome, there stood a formidable state apparatus, with vast human resources and unshakable political resolve. Ultimately, it was this collective strength that triumphed over individual brilliance. The story of the Battle of Cannae transcends mere tactical calculations. It remains a profound ancient drama of intellect and force, cunning and resilience, triumph and tragedy. It narrates how a single individual, driven by youthful vows and unyielding determination, challenged and nearly defeated the mightiest power of the world, yet ultimately failed to deliver the fatal blow that could have shattered the empire forever. This timeless narrative continues to resonate, reminding us that even the greatest geniuses cannot succeed without the support of broader systems and resources, the true foundations of victory. As we gaze today upon the tranquil valley of the Afanta River in southern Italy, where the land peacefully rests beneath rows of olive trees and lush vineyards, a profound realization dawns. This very ground has absorbed the bloodshed of approximately 100,000 people, leaving a silent, enduring imprint of countless lives lost in ancient warfare. It becomes painfully clear that the Battle of Cannae, which took place on the 2nd of August in the year 1126 before the Common Era, did not simply conclude on that historical date. Instead, it perpetuates through eternity. This historic clash continues to echo across the pages of military textbooks, ongoing debates among historians, and within the digital realms of modern computer simulations. The memory of it is constantly reenacted in the minds of every lieutenant studying tactics and in the strategic calculations of every general planning an operation. The battle embodies a timeless contest, a perpetual struggle between sheer numbers and tactical brilliance, between brute force and cunning intellect, between cumbersome, rigid systems and the nimble ingenuity of a lone genius. Though, in that particular ancient confrontation, the prevailing system ultimately achieved victory, the brilliance of Hannibal's masterfully crafted tactical masterpiece at Kenny on the dusty plains remains unforgettable. Its legendary status is preserved as an eternal monument to the potential of human intellect on the battlefield. This enduring legacy reminds us that the art of war is a continuous, unending story, one that intertwines the results of past encounters with the ever-evolving strategies of the present. We thank you for spending your time with us, diving into the depths of history and contemplating the eternal battles that have shaped our world. Should this story resonate with you, we encourage you to explore more of these journeys through time, uncovering the most mysterious and monumental chapters of the past that continue to inspire and instruct us.